Exactly.
So one of you has some slides. Is that the situation?
Yeah, all of this is the other.
Yes, I'm here, and this is a double act.
So can we ask, who should we put on screen? Oh, we've got double. Okay, that's fine. It's all sorted. Thank
Liz
you.
and I have been collaborating on this for about 5 years. We started just before COVID, and so it then was postponed for a while. So this is really interesting.
Sorry, Lindsay, I haven't actually read what you're going to be talking about. I'm so sorry.
It's okay, you can tell.
So,
So, Lindsay, could you introduce the paper, please? Thank you.
yes, I'm going to ask Liz to present the first part of this.
Right. Do you have the slides that you can share, Lindsay?
I do.
Yeah, excellent. So the paper is called Looking at Edward Wilson's Antarctic Watercolours. Can I ask if you, oh, I can see the screen from here in the room. I just wait until the slides are there. Okay, that's brilliant.
See the screen.
Okay.
Slides.
Can you see them okay? Yeah.
Yeah, we're good.
Perfect. So Dr. Edward Wilson was a member of the Discovery Expedition 1901 to 1904 and the Terra Nova Expedition 1910 to 1913, which were led by Robert Falcon Scott. Wilson was a zoologist and artist on the Discovery and then Chief of Scientific Staff on the Terra Nova Expedition. He made a visual record of what he saw by sketching in daylight and painting in watercolour at night in the winter base hut, illuminated by the light of an acetylene gas lamp. On each expedition, Wilson commented that when working by the light of the acetylene gas lamp, the blues and yellows were likely to go wrong. This presentation examines the question of colour, its study, and the representation of polar exploration by Wilson in more detail. Scientific expeditions to the Antarctic used a combination of technologies to document the environment, its wildlife, and meteorological phenomena. Pencil sketches, watercolours, journals, photography, and film were employed to record scientific works such as zoology, meteorology, and subsequently to illustrate expedition narratives in exhibitions, cinema, and lantern slide lectures, which were intended for a public spectatorship. The perception of colour was vital to the study of Antarctic regions, from its wildlife and sea creatures to meteorological phenomena, such as parslane and aurora australis. Wilson made ornithological studies, sketches of coastlines and geographical features such as Mount Erebus as monochrome colour note sketches in pencil, which he annotated with written notes regarding the hues of each subject. Wilson's notebooks include numerous references to issues encountered in the study of colour. In sketching from direct observation, he found chalks impracticable for the accumulation of dirt, whilst watercolours and the watercolour brush froze to the page. Similarly, experiments with colour photography were lost or deemed unsuccessful, such as those of Reginald Kirtlitz on the Discovery Expedition. Work on board the Discovery and in the winter base hut necessitated the use of artificial light sources, which you saw on the first slide, particularly during the 3 months of darkness that characterised the polar winter. On that first slide, you'll see the sources of artificial light available on each expedition. On each of Scott's expeditions, an acetylene gas lamp was built, which produced gas by dripping water onto calcium carbide, but the supply of gas was intermittent. You can see the colour note sketches on screen that Wilson used as a work in process, and some were memory sketches which he made up later and which he generated later. So he was working outside in freezing temperatures. The pencil sketches were annotated with generic colour names such as red or yellow, which he would subsequently use to inform painting of watercolours inside the hut. However, the vagaries of artificial light also affected his perception of the pigments required to match the coloration of the scene. So you'll see the exhibition catalogue on screen. Both Scott and Wilson directly linked the availability of artificial light, such as the rationing of candles, to labour and morale. Wilson found that his work difficult to complete by oil lamp and candlelight. Electricity was available in the officers' quarters on the Discovery until May 1902, when the wind turbine was damaged in a gale. It's important to note that there's a social hierarchy on the expeditions that's connected to access to light, proximity to windows, electric light, etc. So further, that the practicalities of work in the Antarctic often formed the basis of newspaper articles. The peculiarities of lighting and innovation were considered to appeal to readers in the modern metropolis in Britain. For example, a 1914 review of an exhibition of Wilson's work in the New Archaeological Museum, Cambridge, included watercolours from the Discovery and Terra Nova expeditions and described, quote, works painted for the most part in snow, lit by the smoky acetylene lamp, with a number of men around doing anything from trimming a lamp to mending harness. In May 1903, Scott recorded in his diary that the acetylene plant was now in full swing and gives us light for 12 hours at an expenditure of 3 pounds of carbide. So there's a quote, slide with quotes from Wilson. His comments indicate dates, locations, and subjects studied and painted by the light of the acetylene gas lamp. If you see the next slide, is the colour note sketch of his painting in 1903, indicates orange and mauve in pencil and then painted. And the next slide shows Herbert Ponting's photograph of Wilson working on a watercolour under the light of an acetylene gas lamp. It's taken in 1911 on the Terra Nova expedition. The presence of industrial contaminants such as coal dust and soot is visible in fingerprints at the edges of the lampshade in Ponting's photograph, further complicating the perception of colour in Wilson's work. The numerous environmental factors inside and external to the shelter of the ship and hut intersect with the history of materials that are integral to Wilson's practice. On the next slide, you see Ponting's flashlight photograph of Wilson and a digital scan of the painting that he was working on. And this slide shows indicates an analysis of colour materials and light as it intersects with Ponting's black and white photograph. The points to note here are that Ponting made a series of photographic representations or stagings of very broadly scientific research, yet in the photographs that depict these moments of visual scientific acuity, the sitter's blinded by flashlight. There are fingerprints in dust on the lampshade, a layer that Charlotte Ribberell tells us filters light. It's an orthochromatic photograph in which reds appear too dark, blues too light, and further by the light of the acetylene gas lamp, blues and yellows would appear odd. Ponting found that phenomena such as aurora australis and the paraselene eluded photographic documentation. Wilson's painting shows such a paraselene in a pictorial composition which frames a meteorological phenomenon that was intended for sale. The detail of the painting that you see at the side shows a spectrum of light like a rainbow painted in a selection of watercolours, their pigments gathered from trade routes across the then British Empire. In this material and technical space, pigments, contaminants, and light affect and are integral to representations of the Antarctic. That's our rationale for studying colour in Wilson's painting. Lindsay, if you would present your next section.
Our research question was, what did Wilson see when painting these pictures under acetylene gas light? This is a difficult question because he was doing this in a hut in the Antarctic over 100 years ago. So how can we know what he might have been seeing then? Well, there are various factors involved here, and these open the way to some kind of scientific investigation. We actually have a certain amount of information at our disposal. First of all, it depends on the spectral power distribution of the illumination that he was using. This was primarily the acetylene lamp on his desk, but also other sources within the winter hut, including oil lamps and a blubber stove, etc. Second, we have to assume that his vision was fully adapted to the environmental conditions there. The complete set of illuminants that were in the hut. And third, we need to know something about the pigments and especially the spectral reflectance of the colorants in his paintings. Now, the first question was the spectral power distribution of the illumination. Now, I searched the literature and was unable to find any information about the spectra produced by acetylene lamps. So I had to go back to first principles and measure it. And I purchased a bicycle lamp from around 1910, which had similar characteristics to the lamp in the hut. I measured this with my spectroradiometer and obtained a spectrum that you see on the right. It's very low power in the short wavelengths, the bluish wavelengths, and it rises steadily throughout the spectrum and has most of the power in the far red and infrared wavelengths. This is actually very similar to the spectrum of an incandescent source or a candle flame. However, the flame that you get with acetylene depends very much on the amount of oxygen available. So I did some further measurements in an engineering workshop using an industrial oxyacetylene rig, like a cutting torch, and directly measured the flame using my spectroradiometer for a series of increasing levels of oxygen, introducing more oxygen into the mix, moved the flame successively from the orange color of a pure acetylene through to a very bright blue flame. You see the family of graphs on the right is as the oxygen increases, the power at the short wavelengths also increases. And particularly there are 3 line spectra from the combustion of carbon particles within the flame. Those are at low temperatures, they fall as soot onto everything surrounding, whereas with more oxygen, they're actually burned in the combustion process. Now, we're also very fortunate to have Wilson's paintings, even though he and all the team perished in that second expedition. All of his paintings remained behind and were recovered, and they're now at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, who were very helpful in providing access to them. So we called on Headwall Company, who kindly loaned us a hyperspectral scanner, complete with an expert to operate it. And in Cambridge, at the Institute, we scanned a number of the paintings. And these produce not just 3 bands, RGB, as you get with a normal scanner, but 270 spectral bands at narrow wavelength intervals. And this enables colorimetric calculations to be done. The painting we've chosen as an example in this presentation is one called Earth Shadows. And here the hyperspectral image has been processed with a standard daylight, that's D65, and converted to sRGB for display. That's what you would normally get with a a standard display of images on the internet. This painting is special because of the delicate gradations of color throughout, and also the handling of shadows in the foreground. Wilson was clearly very observant and very adept at rendering these pictures very well. Now, suppose we render this for acetylene illumination instead of daylight. There's a horribly orange cast. Now, if you were to turn out the room lights where you're sitting and spend a few minutes adapting to this, you would begin to see it as more normal. But would you see it in the same way as under daylight after that adaptation? What you see on the screen here is more like what you would see if you were adapted to daylight and looked through an aperture into a room or a chamber that was illuminated by the acetylene light. So this raises the question of chromatic adaptation, which is a really interesting research question. We assume that Wilson, when painting at night in the hut, would have been completely adapted to the prevailing illumination. Liz has already mentioned this entry in his notebook where he says, "In blues and yellows, one cannot tell what one is doing." His task was to render in watercolor the paints that the scene he had viewed during the day and commit it to memory. There are various theories about chromatic adaptation, and I've applied 3 different transformations to the hyperspectral images. So the algorithm takes in the illumination spectrum, the reflectance spectrum at each pixel in the image, and also the human sensitivity functions. And the 3 different algorithms that I used are the front end of CLAB, that's the common CIE LAB system, and then 2 more recent front ends of color appearance models. That's from 2002 and 2016. You can see there are slight differences between the 3 renderings, those images on the right. But which is correct? Or is any of them correct? How can we say? What did Wilson actually see when he was painting his pictures? It depends quite a lot on the physical construction of the lamp on his desk. And extraordinarily, that still exists too. All of the equipment and apparatus they were using in the winter hut is still there. And you see in bottom right, there's the remains of a gas pipe that we think might have been the one used in that lamp that he had. The burner on it has a double flame, which is typical of the construction around that time. But the spectrum produced by the flame will also depend on the pressure of the gas, the amount of oxygen available in the atmosphere, and the temperature at which it was burning. And unless we could actually obtain an identical burner and do an experiment under those same conditions, we can only speculate on what the exact spectrum would be. I'm now going to hand back to Liz because there are some other imponderables.
Okay, so the provenance of the watercolor paints is similarly complicated. For example, the location of the paint box that is visible in Ponting's flashlight photograph of Wilson working on a watercolour in 1911 is uncertain. The paint box that you see on screen is held at the Canterbury Christchurch Museum in New Zealand. So although Windsor and Newton were official suppliers of artist materials to both of Scott's Antarctic expeditions, a diverse set of watercolour manufacturers have been connected to Wilson's work. You see a range of watercolours listed on the slide. The provenance of this paint box and those pans of paint that are inside it is connected to Wilson's family. If we could see the next slide, please. The label on that box reads Ackerman & Co. manufacturers of superfine watercolours to Her Majesty Queen, to Her Majesty. So Queen Victoria died in 1901, which dates the box prior to the Discovery expedition. Further, Ida Wilson, Edward Wilson's sister, was also an artist. It's possible that paint box belonged to her. The pans of paint were made by numerous manufacturers across several decades, indicate a process of continual use with a working set of artist paints. The box includes numerous blocks of yellow, red, and blue paint, which use a variety of recipes and pigments from different geographical locations. The watercolour paintings completed by Wilson on board the Discovery and in the Winter Base hut are the remains of global trade in pigments. Wilson's paintings, the materials and physical space, carry a trace of industrial processes and empire as noted in colour names and their colonization of what Gunnar Iversen refers to as seemingly endless white dullness of polar coastlines that were considered problematic to the public presentation of expedition photography. This study then begins to address the complexity of materials and environmental conditions encountered by Wilson and Ponting in Antarctica in the early 1900s, as it affects the study of colour, light, and its role in scientific work of the expedition and its representations. I would end there unless Lindsay has or would like to.
No,